Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thank you so much for being here today. Today, my guest is Jett Galindo, and Jett is awesome. She has been doing so much great work. And if you're not familiar with Jett, Jett is a Filipino mastering engineer based out of Los Angeles who has worked on a number of albums for artists including Barbra Streisand, Weezer, Selena Gomez, Neil Young, Pink Floyd, and so many more. And throughout her career, as you're going to hear in her story, she's had a lot of amazing opportunities that have ultimately led to where she is today as a mastering engineer who, again, is working with some huge level artists. And one of the really unique skills that Jett brings to the table, and we talk about it in this interview, is the fact that she is a vinyl mastering engineer. So when it comes to mastering for vinyl, there are specific needs, and to actually cut vinyl is a very artisanal kind of job. I think that's the word, artisanal. It requires a very specific set of skills that most audio engineers don't have. There's a physical element to cutting vinyl, and in this interview we definitely talk about some of the intricacies of that and some of the nuances of, you know, preparing your tracks for vinyl and what things you need to be aware of so that you get the best quality. So if you're an artist who plans to release your music on vinyl, you're definitely going to pick up a lot of great stuff in this interview. It's stuff that you definitely have to consider when you're going to be choosing a manufacturing plant to work with, or ultimately when you're going to be choosing someone who is going to be making your vinyl master. So I think you're going to get a lot of really cool tips out of this episode. Jett does a great job of answering her questions and providing a lot of great insights and details. So let's just jump right into the interview. Jett Galindo, thank you so much for being on the Master Mix podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be part of your episodes finally, and I am ready to nerd out and chat.
Awesome. We love that. For people who might not know your story, can you give us that background on how you got into music production and ultimately to mastering and where you are today?
Okay. I'm going to try to keep it short because me coming here all the way from the Philippines, you go through a lot of journeys in your story. But essentially, I grew up with a family of musicians, but them being musicians, they also say to their kids that they want their kids to pursue a quote-unquote real college degree or something, especially like Asian parents. I come from the Philippines. So I finished a degree in psychology, but I've always loved music. And my parents being band managers, they manage and teach cover bands in the Philippines.
Amazing.
I've always been exposed to just modern music since I was born. And all the way through college, I guess it's my way of rebellion, but I got into classical music. So I toured with a choral group for a long time in the Philippines. So as I was finishing my psychology degree, I was also touring with my choral ensemble in the US, Europe, Asia. So it was a fun experience of combining both modern and classical music as I studied psychology. And it kind of was a weird combination that made it such a good blend of skill sets to get into audio engineering. And so the question of how I got into audio engineering is because my dad's always encouraged me to tinker with technology and equipment. We're all three sisters in my family, and I'm the one that really got into building computers growing up. And I got into programming and web development when I was a kid, when internet was just starting out, me building websites in GeoCities, Angel Fire. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those sites,
those,
but yeah, but I got into that stuff. So, I've always just loved technology. I've always loved music, but I'm not really a composer. So I just knew that I'm very much into music and live and breathe it, but not as a songwriter or producer. But as I was touring with my choir and we went here in the US, I got introduced into this path called audio engineering. And that's when everything just clicked. And before, as I was directionless when I was studying psychology, because I knew I wanted to pursue music. when I discovered audio engineering at that time, that's when everything just became so laser focused. And I just knew that I wanted to be a sound engineer while I was studying psychology all the way in thousands of miles in the Philippines. And there's really no audio engineering school in the Philippines. So all I knew was I have to study abroad, study here in the US. But as I got ready for that, I just knew that I had to be exposed to as much technology as possible as I was in the Philippines. So me being very much tech savvy, I got into this job working as a multimedia training coordinator for priests and nuns. I'm not gonna get deep into that because it's another long story, but I taught web development, graphics design, video editing to pastoral workers. Yeah, but that's just I just knew I had to be immersed in technology as I prepared to study abroad. And it just so happened that that multimedia training facility had a recording studio as well. And they were actually looking for interns. And it's all very just a really cool consequent like turn of events. Maybe in a way where if you really want something, it's like the universe kind of like falls into place to like help you get towards your dream or whatever. But yeah, so I was working in that recording studio for 4 years when I decided that, okay, it's time for me to go study formally. So that's when I got accepted into Berklee College of Music in Boston. And that's where I pursued music production and engineering with a minor in acoustics and electronics. And when I graduated in 2012, I was supposed to have a job lined up waiting for me as a recording engineer for the Aspen Music Festival in Colorado. But because my international employment authorization card did not arrive on time, like I had to be dropped off of that job just a few days after it started. So my 3 months after graduating was just completely blank. And as an international student in the US, you had just 1 year to work whichever job you had, and then you had to head back to your home country. So I was just scrambling to figure out the next step now that like my first 3 months was open. And I guess just being really eager to get immersed in audio engineering during my studies in Berklee College of Music. The head of the audio engineering department recommended me for Avatar Studios in New York. I was just like when I was in Berklee, I was just really immersed in the audio engineering world. It's like I really did nothing but engineer for students. I would be busy studying during the day, but after that, I would just be in the studio all the time, building my portfolio as an audio engineering student. But when other engineering students had a home studio, mine was different. I had a mobile recording rig because me coming from a classical background, I just loved classical location recording. So I also recorded a lot of ensembles in MIT and Harvard. And yeah, that was my thing. But I guess building all that portfolio while I was in Berklee just helped with all the recommendations come in as soon as I needed job opportunities. And that's when I thought that my future's already going to be set in stone when I started in New York. When I was engineering at Avatar Studios, I got to work with Nile Rodgers, Roberta Flack, and my boss, Jerry Barnes, is such an amazing bassist and producer. But I got a call from one of the professors in Berklee College of Music telling me about an opportunity to be the mastering assistant of Doug Sax. And for those who are in the world of mastering, Doug Sax is considered the grandfather of mastering. He opened the very first independent mastering facility in 1967 called the Mastering Lab. And at that point, his assistant at the time had to leave. So it's like they were scrambling to find someone to take over. And rather than do the typical like post job listings, because it's the mastering lab, they relied on like by word of mouth. And somehow that led to me applying for it, interviewing for it, and me getting the job. So it's like I chose to leave New York and all of the great things about it to start my path towards becoming a mastering engineer all the way in Ojai, California. So Ojai is kind of like 2 hours away from Los Angeles, but it feels like you're 6 hours away just because of how secluded it is. It's like all the way up in the valleys. And yeah, it like no billboards anywhere. It's very much like countryside feeling. So and I didn't have a car at that time, so I just biked to work every day, and it's a completely different life from New York. But that's what started my journey to mastering. So I officially became a mastering engineer under Doug Sax at the Mastering Lab in 2013, and that's also when my journey to vinyl cutting started. Because even at this point, you really can't learn how to be a vinyl cutter and vinyl mastering engineer in any school. It's very much an apprenticeship type situation. And there's actually a lot of opportunities for vinyl cutting, but we can get there later. But yeah, that's essentially how I started my journey. It's like once you learn under Doug Sax, it's like you have no choice but to keep being a mastering engineer because it's a freaking rare opportunity, and I was lucky to have been chosen for that path.
Of course.
But yeah, that's the gist of it all.
That's amazing. You know, like I love hearing stories like that because I think that for so many people, especially younger people that are maybe going to audio college or something like that, there's this like thought that my path is going to be very linear and I'm going to go to school and I'm going to immediately get a job because I went to school and then I'm going to be set forever. And it's like, it's great to hear your story where like you did bounce around a lot and you did a lot of different things. And ultimately that put you in the best situation possible for, you know, to when this opportunity arose, right?
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it. It's like, I met with another amazing engineer. Her name's Cynthia Daniels, who's like a 2-time Grammy-winning engineer. And how she described her career path to me was that rather than a linear, it feels more like a spiral because you feel like you're moving forward, but then you keep being pulled back and then forward again and pulled back. And you feel that you're just stuck in a circle, but actually you're like elevating yourself in every like cycle that feels like you're not going anywhere, but you're actually moving. And I think that's just one of the things that is very reassuring to hear because it's like we all go through weird like sidesteps and like challenges along the way, but every challenge really just gets us stronger. We might not sense it, but the thing is, it's like if you love what you do, you're I think that passion is what's going to keep you driving you forward. It might not feel like it, but it's like a spiral. It's like you're kind of like elevating in your journey, even if it feels like you're just being in a circular motion, but it's not.
Of course. And part of the journey is having those setbacks as well, right? It's like it's like nature's way of testing you sometimes to see like how badly do you really want this? If I throw you a curveball, are you going to run with this or are you going to just
failures
give up,
are
right?
Great. Yeah, failures are because you are going to if you're going to be a mastering or mixing engineer, you're going to be working with clients, and part of the whole nature of being a mixer and mastering engineer is it's a client centric. It's a service industry. We tend to forget that, but at the end of the day, we're offering our skill sets to help take someone's art to its final destination, and you have to be comfortable with the feeling of feedbacks and critiques, and being comfortable with the whole process. And that's the great thing about music. It's like it's collaboration, and if you feel that you have to be winning all the time and you have to be right all the time, then that's a sucky collaboration, in my opinion.
Yeah,
right?
I guess that's where your psychology background definitely comes in handy, right? It's like learning how to deal with people.
I know, but it's funny because someone said like if you're in a recording studio, not just as a mastering engineer, but also in recording or mixing, you kind of like turn into the bartender, because it's like you end up just listening to all these artists like talk about their lives, and then you it's your job to keep like serving the drinks, aka like making music and just making them comfortable. And then once it's done, the stories stay inside.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's funny. Yeah, we're like musical bartenders.
Yeah.
I like that.
And the people who are really good at it are the ones that ultimately like keep clients, right? It's like if you that's like the interesting part about working in the studio, is that it is very much a relationship, and how you nurture that relationship while you're working with people, and how you listen to people, and how you offer creative criticism and all that kind of stuff. It's all a delicate thing. So it's like, if you know how to handle that really well, you'll make people feel comfortable, and then they'll ultimately want to continue working with you. But like, it's very easy to break that level of trust between the artist and the producer or engineer, mastering engineer, whatever,
like,
right?
That's one of the things that is probably a bit underrated when you're getting into this career path in music, because you can spend thousands of dollars like studying how to operate the next DAW, or like training your ears, or saving up for the next set of trendy plugins. But like at the end of the day, it's like people are going to choose to work with you because they like you. It's like they get along with you.
Of course.
So yeah, it's like people skills, whether we like it or not, is still a big part of this industry. And I'm a freaking introvert, so it's like it's a balance.
Absolutely. It's funny because I feel like so many guests that I've had on the podcast have talked about the importance of communication skills and having those personal skills. And I feel like a part of me when I made this podcast was like, people don't want to hear that. They want to just talk about gear and like all this nerdy stuff. But it's like, everyone listening to this, like, there's a reason this topic has come up so many times, and it's something that you have to pay attention to, and something that you have to be aware of, because if you mess this up, you can easily mess up your career. And so, this is a great example of like, why you need to be a good person, and what that means, and how to work with people and keep them coming back to you, right?
Yeah, you're right. I'm glad that you agree with that too. We were like talking about this just a few minutes ago, about how in music there's really no right or wrong. Mm-hmm. So you can train to be the best engineer in the world, but if you don't allow yourselves to let go of your ego, so you can really pick the brain of your collaborator and understand the vision they want, and at the end of the day, it's like their vision is just as important as you knowing the tools of the trade. So yeah, it's a really fine balance. And even if you're like, you feel that you're not really like the most socially skilled person in the world, like at the end of the day, it's like you love what you do, so it's the passion that's gonna drive you forward. And at the end of the day, no matter who you are, no matter whether you're like the most likable person in the world, there's always gonna be people who will drive with you more than others. Mm-hmm. And so it's always chemistry. And I guess the more you collaborate with others, the more you discover who you jive with, and
of course
you get to find your community and your tribe easier that way.
Yeah, I think it's equally as important to know who is not your ideal client, and than it is to know who it is, right? Like, you have to know what your values are, how those align with the people you're working with, and if you have to turn down a project because they don't align with your values, like, that's great. You've just freed up your time for something else. So it's like that is just equally as important. Yeah, and I think too, like doing like a self-audit sometimes of like the way you handle relationships. It's something that's hard to do, but it's necessary to do. A book that I would recommend to people who are listening to this is called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it sounds like such a schmarmy kind of title, and like it sounds like it'd be a horrible book, but it's actually a really good book.
I'd read that.
Yeah,
who's the author?
I can't remember offhand. I want to say it's Dale Carnegie, but the idea of it is just kind of like all these little ways that you can just like have better communication with people. And it's these little ideas that, like, if you just pay attention to this little thing and the way you answer it, or the way you like interact, or like the way you present yourself like physically or whatever, like these are the things that can make an impact on the communication. And it's something I would definitely recommend people read, as much as it's like kind of like a horrible title. You know, it actually is a really good book to like do that self audit and to be like, oh, am I actually listening to this, or am I shooting people down all the time and that kind of stuff. So I think it's definitely something worth reading for people, or get the audiobook or something.
If you ever get that book, like put it on the same like bookshelf as your audio 101 or audio technology, like Bob Katz's books.
Yeah, of course.
Like combine them all, and you're well on your way to success as a studio owner.
Of course. There was something else you mentioned a little bit ago. You were talking about the idea of like, you know, constantly keeping up to date with the new technology and that kind of stuff. And it sounds like that was kind of a big motivator for you in your past. Like you're always driven by the tech and finding these new things. And ultimately that led to where you are. So how important is it to you to be keeping up with like the new trends that are happening with the software and just the mastering world in general? Is that an important thing, or is it kind of one of those things where once you've learned it, you can just keep doing it?
That's so funny. But as you're asking me that question, I'm trying to like analyze how to approach this, but it's really kind of like a yes or no situation, because it's important to learn the foundations of the whole audio production process, because at the end of the day, if you just decide to skip that and just look for a tutorial on how to like use Isotope RX, how to use an equalizer, you might learn how to use a plugin, but you really won't understand the reasons behind it. And understanding the foundations and like reading up on Audio 101 will already give you a leg up in terms of like approaching the whole audio production process. Like when I went to audio school, one of the things that we spent a lot of time on studying is how large format analog consoles work. The reality is many of us students will never have to use a large format console after graduating from school. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is all these plugins, all these DAWs that you're going to be playing around with all follow the same signal flow, same functionalities as the large format consoles that they were designed from. So understanding that the foundations of your signal chain, understanding the reasons behind sample rates and bit depth and your DACs, understanding the whys will help you make smarter decisions to your music. And at the same time, for example, you look up the internet and YouTube on how to operate all these new plugins, which is great. That is amazing. But at the same time, once you've learned how these tools work, having all these foundations really back up your knowledge will really help you empower and go beyond what has been covered in all these YouTube videos. Because at the end of the day, like any information out there or manual about how each of these devices, tools, DAWs, plugins work, there's so much more beyond what has been covered. And a lot of that you really just discover the more you play around with it, the more you listen to it, and the more you apply it to your everyday production. So I really understand the value of like really strengthening the foundations of your audio knowledge. And at the same time, it's nice to like keep your self up to date with what's happening out there. So for example, like the whole discussion about Atmos. So it's nice to like keep yourself up to date about like what's going on about Atmos, but at the same time, a lot of the decisions that are done in Atmos is really done with the foundation of stereo production. Stereo is still king and will remain king for a lot of reasons. And we can go into a deep dive about that, but it's still good to be aware of like what's out there. And I mean, even like the technologies and the music production, the business techniques you learn because of like all the evolving industries out there, like music on TikTok, royalties that you get from all the new streaming platforms that are out there. There's a lot But yeah, you get to be smarter about analyzing all these like new, like massive information that gets thrown at you by having that foundation. So it's really like a healthy combination. I hope I'm making sense.
No, that makes sense. Like, I think it can definitely be dangerous to constantly be learning. And the biggest thing is like implementing always, right? Like if you're just binge watching YouTube videos or whatever, that even if it's like reading books or whatever, like if you're not doing anything with that information, then it's not actually going to help you. You're just consuming it. And I agree with you on the topic of like the YouTube videos and people talking about plugins, because often it seems like a lot of those videos are so focused on this is how great this plugin is, and if you have this plugin, it will do everything you need it to. And really, it's like if you take a step back and you actually look at like, wait a minute, they're all saying the same thing, and there's like 30 different EQ plugins or 30 different compressor plugins, but wait a minute, like the actual process is the same. You know, like that's that foundation that you need to understand. And when you understand that foundation, then you don't need to watch a YouTube video for every single plugin that you use, because you already have that foundation. You know how that tool works.
And just to add to that too, so what, for example, one good example is Ozone or Ozone 8. And I use Ozone, and I even contribute mastering articles for their Learn portal. So I highly recommend checking out the Isotope Learn portal. And Ozone is one of those plugins that offers everything, like everything, including the kitchen sink. It's like any tool or functionality that you have would be on there. But the fact of the matter is, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you need them? And most of the times, a lot of successful mixers, recording engineers, and mastering engineers do well at their job because they don't have to deal with so many decision-making buttons every day. It's like, for example, I like FabFilter Pro L2 because it's simple. It might not have a lot of features, but the features that are there work. Now, for like giant tools like Ozone, there are great tools out there, but if your settings are incorrect, or if you didn't pay attention too much to what this function is doing to your sound, it can actually take away and kind of ruin the sound if you don't have your settings correctly. So sometimes it's like having everything under one toolkit might be dangerous.
Yeah,
so
sometimes simplifying is better. And it's funny because I always think to like, whenever I look at a picture of a mastering studio versus a recording studio, it's like you see in the recording studio, you see like racks and racks of gear everywhere and big console. It's like buttons everywhere, right? And then you look at a mastering studio and it's usually like 5 or 6 pieces in a small desk. And it's like, yeah, sure, they got the computer and they have equally as many plugins sometimes. But like, it seems like mastering engineers tend to just focus on like, hey, these are my tools. I'm going to work within these limitations. And sometimes that is a really good thing. And it, as far as your workflow goes, like having those set tools that you use on a regular basis just allows you to work faster and smarter, because you're not trying to figure out something new every time you work, right?
And just to add to what you said about mastering studios having a simple chain, just to stress how minimalist our chain is, one of the things that really make our studio sing are the 2 line amps. And line amps are essentially what they are. They just add level. But the way they add level, just the whole characteristic difference between our tube line amp and solid state line amp already makes such a big difference to our decisions in the mastering chain. And then back at the mastering lab, Doug, my mentor, really only had 2 shelf EQs, a compressor, and a limiter. That's it. And of course, it's a surround mastering facility, so every channel had their own, but that's it. And it's completely analog. And he's brought a lot of Grammys into the studio and for artists that way. Like, simple is key, not because it's simple, but the thing is, you can do a lot of things with just one tool, but mastering or being really good at understanding the functions of each tool. Like, I would just recommend, if anyone wants to get into mastering or just production in general, start with the Pro Q3 like the FabFilter Pro Q3 EQ. Learn every shape, learn every bandwidth shape, like whether it's a bell curve, high pass or low pass filter, even like the dB per octave shape. Just understanding every little thing there, and not use any other EQ. Just use that one and understand every little thing, and you're already way ahead of your peers.
It's true. It's like I remember one challenge that I got a long time ago from one of my mentors was like, make a mix using all high pass filters, or like using all like filters, high pass, low pass, or shelves, and like just do those. Like you only have those 4 options. Make a mix, and it's like it's incredible how you can approach a mix that way, and
it's very freeing.
It's very free. It feels like a limit at first, and then you're like, wait a minute, like I've been doing like 5 boosts above this frequency, like to make up for the same thing I could do with one shelf, And it's like, so it's a very interesting concept.
It's really cool. And somehow, I guess, one of the reasons why, a lot of people think that mastering is like a dark art is because, like, I guess the one thing that surprises a lot of people is that we mastering engineers get to do what we do because of how minimalist and, simple our approach is. And sometimes simplicity is like something a lot of people can't grasp. You'd be surprised by how little we use compressors in mastering facilities. And I've spoken to other mastering colleagues. Like at the end of the day, the reason why our chain is simple is because we only put something on our chain when it has a purpose. And we always the thing that you have to keep in mind when you're mastering is that you're working on music that's already been approved to the best of the abilities and circumstance in on the mixer and artist's side. So we approach mastering in a way where we're not there to change the music. We're there to really bring the best out of the music, enhance it, and maybe address certain challenges that couldn't be fixed by the mixer or the artist. But yeah, we're there to really just enhance and really bring the music up to 100%. And yeah, many times a compressor isn't needed for that. And we get to do a lot of amazing things with just an EQ and a limiter. We will need a limiter for mastering, but EQ can already give you so much power, not just in mastering, but in mixing too.
Absolutely. And I love what you said there about like choosing gear for a purpose and like being intentional with that. And yeah, going to that idea of like learning your plugins inside and out. Another thing about mastering that has always struck me in a lot of ways is like how minimal a lot of these things are. Like EQ, like mastering engineers always talk about, oh, if you're using like maybe like a dB and a half of EQ, like sometimes that's more than enough, right? And like to a lot of people that seems like, that's unheard of, right? It's like in the mixing world, people will crank it like 12 dB or whatever. So I think it's like there's something to the idea of also challenging yourself to make mixes or to make masters where you are using just small amounts and seeing how that adds up over time and how big of a difference that can make. And I think it also trains your ears to like notice those little like small details that you've added to something, right?
Yeah, I agree. And one thing that I recommend as an exercise for anyone that's, even those who aren't mastering engineers, people who are just starting out, I would highly recommend, and this is something I do on a daily basis as a mastering engineer, is to do blind A/B comparisons. A/B is essentially having the same music with the same settings, just 2 copies of it, and then one copy will have like one slight difference. So for example, like a 1 dB at 1K versus 1 dB at 3K. That's a lot in mastering lingo. But if one track will have all the same settings except for that 1 dB at 1K, and then the other track would be the same settings, but that 1 dB is at 3K instead of 1K. And then if you're in Pro Tools, you just select one track and mute it, and then select both, and then just hold Shift M, Shift M, Shift M. So it's like you're switching between the two,
Yeah.
and you're not looking at your screen. You're just listening. So it's like you're really comparing the two and going blind, like not knowing what you're listening to, but really just zoning in on that difference. And then it's crazy how that makes your ear so much more sensitive, and it's very empowering as a producer and engineer to really hear the difference.
Yeah, there's actually a free tool out there that you can get. It's made by a company called Nugent, and they actually have a plugin called A/B Assist. And what that does, if I'm remembering it correctly, it is a blind testing tool. So you can actually you can actually throw your tracks in there, and it'll randomize it for you, and you can test it out that way. I haven't looked at it in a while, so I could be wrong about that. But I know that there is definitely a plugin out there, and I think it's Nugent A/B Assist.
Hang on a second. Okay, so Nugent. Okay, let's look it up, because Nugent Audio is actually really cool. And in fact, for those who are listening, I can give all the information to Mike later. But if it is Nugent Audio, I have a code here that gets you 20% off on all Nugent Audio plugins.
Amazing.
The gift code is Women in Vinyl. I'll give that information to you later, Mike. But yeah,
Sure.
I do a lot of work for the Women in Vinyl community. Look them up. And Nugent Audio is offering 20% discount on anything, on any of their plugins. But yeah, that's a funny segue.
Yeah, that's funny.
But this podcast is not sponsored by Nugent. Don't worry.
Hey, I would love to. Hey, if they're interested in it, feel free to reach out to me, someone. Yeah.
Yeah, Nugent's awesome. I'm glad you mentioned them. They're a great company.
Yeah. So yeah, I believe that Nugent plugin actually does blind test for you. So that's a really great way. Like, I totally agree. The blind testing thing is such a great tool to just learn and to actually hear those details. And I also love I've loved whenever a plugin manufacturer makes I've seen Steven Slate do this a couple times with his plugins, where he'll be like, okay, here's my plugin, here's another one, which one sounds better? And then he'll be like, oh, I didn't even change it, so
yeah, blind tests are great, because it's like, it's very revealing. You'd be surprised by the results you get by just doing blind tests.
Yeah, there's some psychology for you too, right? Just that psychology of something changing. You think it should sound different, or you think it should sound one way, but yeah,
it's like it's psychoacoustics. Like the whole thing where sometimes you think that there's a difference, but you're actually just listening to the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the whole thing about you thought you're working on this compressor this whole time, but it's been bypassed this whole time. But yeah, blind tests really train your ears to get more intimately familiar with your tools.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you were first starting off as a mastering engineer, then it sounds like you were in the studio, you were already doing recording stuff. Do you feel like as a mastering engineer, you need to have that foundational knowledge of being a recording and mixing engineer, or can someone just get right into mastering, or is that
that's
you need
such a great question, Mike. And I always joke about this when I get asked about this. If anyone wants to become a mastering engineer, the fact of the matter is, I did not grow up as a kid telling everyone that I want to be a mastering engineer when I grow up. And I'm pretty sure that all mastering engineers don't have the same experience, where any of us didn't really anticipate being full-time mastering engineers. And that's only something that fell in our journey to us, and that's what we ended up embracing. And I'm sure a lot of other amazing engineers in their niche career paths didn't anticipate, for example, a forensic audio engineer probably didn't expect that they would be in forensics, And I think that's one of the beauties of mastering, is that you're in mastering because you're collaborating with people. Unless you're an EDM producer who just masters their own stuff. And I know a lot of killer EDM producers that are freaking awesome when it comes to mastering their music. But it's more likely that if you're mastering, you're working with other people. And one of the things that really make you an effective mastering engineer is understanding the language and the whole process when it comes to recording and mixing. so me coming from a recording and mixing background makes me a more effective communicator as a mastering engineer. And there are also times when you're collaborating with producers, artists, engineers, their way of communicating don't necessarily, in a way this is probably better. A lot of the communication that happens don't necessarily fall under just numbers. Like, a lot of clients are not going to say, I think it needs more 5K. Maybe could we lessen the 50K on there?
Most
the
people
50
don't
hertz.
know that.
Yeah. The point is, it actually can make more sense if the artist or producer engineer would say, can we? I just want a little bit of brightness on this, or like someone would say, can I get more definition or clarity in the lows? I feel like I want to hear more of that attack on the kick. That makes more sense because like different engineers and our respective tools behave differently. So someone's 50 hertz will probably be different on a mastering engineer's analog 50 hertz. So talking more in a more musical language makes more sense. And in that case, having this experience and deep understanding of artists in the production, recording, and mixing standpoint makes you a more effective mastering engineer in terms of understanding what these people are asking for. So, and at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that you have to learn how to record, mix, and master if you want to be a mastering engineer. Like, there's really no rule. But I found that a recording, mix, and mixing background really helps in mastering.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you said earlier about learning the foundations. And part of the foundations is being able to actually like characterize the different frequency ranges. And that's really what it is. Like, that's how like the people who don't understand the actual frequencies themselves, like that's how they communicate. You know,
exactly.
It's always like the bright and dark and muddy or attack and punchy, that kind of thing. So it's like, if you can define what those frequencies sound like, or what those sounds are in the frequency range, then you now have this like almost, you're like kind of like you can speak two languages almost, you know, like
exactly. You're translating what they're asking for, and it actually is helping with the whole person like connection, because a lot of artists would have expressed that they're a bit shy or hesitant about sharing their viewpoints because they don't talk frequencies. And it's your job in mastering to really encourage them and feel that they're comfortable in your space, that they shouldn't be afraid to like share to you what they think of the music.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that is kind of interesting that ties into this is the idea of like untrained ears versus trained ears. And when you have customers that are saying, can you make things brighter? It's almost like in the mixing world, we talk about boosting big frequency amounts. Like, you know, you might boost like 5 dB or whatever. But in mastering, I know that people are so subtle with it. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on why mastering is about like subtle boosts. And will people even hear those? Or like, can you go extreme with it in mastering? Like, is there a time and place for that?
That's really cool. So, being extreme, sometimes you don't realize that you have to like add more elbow grease when you're already there. It's like you can't really anticipate it. It will depend on the music. But one of the reasons why adjustments in mastering are much more subtle than in mixing or recording is because in mastering, you're working with the music as a whole rather than multi-tracks. Because your goal in mastering is to really is to have this stereo mix and really bring out the best in the sound quality before it gets sent out to the music marketplace. So one adjustment that you would make in the in the tonal balance overall, like 1 dB at 10K will not just affect one instrument, it will affect everything. So it might seem subtle when you're not in the mastering space, but if you're the mastering engineer and you're also the client, 1 dB at 10K is actually going to be very noticeable, especially if once you're intimately familiar with the music. Like once you're in it, it just a lot of things are much more felt sonically, and small adjustments will already make all the difference. In fact, like you'd be surprised by how just adding gain, like adding a bit of low shelf EQ attenuation at 50 hertz, and just adding a bit of air will make a huge difference and even your limiter shape. Like let's go back to Pro L2, which I use a lot in the studio. Having the same settings, but switching between the different limiter shapes, because in Pro L2 there's transparent shape, dynamic, aggressive. You'd be surprised by how different each of those sound. One is not necessarily better than the other. But just do a blind test comparison of the different shapes. It already makes a drastic change that does not require any EQ. In fact, you can even just not do any EQ or compression processing, just throw in a limiter and audition between those different shapes, and it will already make a huge difference. So yeah, in a nutshell, smaller adjustments are more felt because you're approaching the music as a whole rather than individual tracks.
That makes a lot of sense the way you put it. Yeah.
I didn't want to go on a tangent, but like I'm sure there's going to be a question about stem mastering. But the point is that the essence of mastering is that we're working on the finalized mix that's been approved by everyone, and you're going to be the final gate before the music gets sent out into the real world. So yeah, those small adjustments will make a whole lot of difference. So you have to be very subtle, and you'll realize that subtlety will come naturally to you when you're finally in that mastering seat.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So another question that I have that kind of ties into this a little bit is the idea of, I've heard some people say that mastering is about making broad moves with things like EQ versus surgical moves. And I would assume that when we're talking about these kind of 1 dB moves, that we're probably doing more of a broad move so that it's like more obvious that it's covering more of that like kind of higher frequency range or what the brightness, whatever we want to call it, right? Is that your approach?
Actually, yes, and I also know that a lot of other mastering engineers have that approach. But so when I make, for example, EQ decisions, I tend to be more wide with my bandwidth. So like the Q is just a bit more wider because it just makes for a smoother overall tonal balance adjustment. When you're EQing, it's not because you want to EQ the tambourine. You don't just want to EQ the S. You don't just want to EQ the lead vocal. If that's one of the biggest things you have to adjust with your mindset when you're jumping from the mixing seat to the mastering seat. You're approaching the adjustments not by instrument, but by the overall sound. And it's by having that broad EQ shape where you're aiming for an overall tonal balance adjustment that really just adjusts the overall sound in a way that's not that's more transparent. Because having that broad adjustment at like even half a dB, but just a wider bandwidth, it actually makes a lot of difference. That's smoother and less noticeable, and just feels more immersive with the music itself. When you're doing a very sharp EQ gain of 1 dB at 5K, there's going to be a weird hump that will not feel glued into the music. Again, it's not a rule. There might be cases where I do that. But yeah, like broad, there's a reason why a lot of mastering engineers approach their subtle EQs in a broad shape, because we're aiming for a tonal balance adjustment rather than like an instrument EQ.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, I like the way you put it of like, you're not trying to EQ the tambourine. It's like, and I think that's one of the big reasons why, it is a good idea to send your mixes off to a mastering engineer, because they're taking it from that different perspective. Like, as the mixing engineer, you have like analyzed the crap out of every single individual track, and you're still thinking that way, you know? And so when you're in a mastering stage, if that's how you're approaching things, then yeah, you're going to be using lots of surgical boosts and cuts and stuff like that, but you're going to add all these weird tones to it, and you know, the thing that you boosted to bring up that tambourine is also going to bring out some of the vocal air or like cymbals and that kind of stuff. So, you know, you have to treat it separately.
One mastering, Pete Dell, who's an amazing mastering engineer based in LA, I liked how he described it. It's more about observing the overall forest as opposed to looking at one tree at a time. It's a very different perspective, and I think that's actually a perfect analogy.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great way to put it, for sure. Yeah, that's awesome. I did want to talk about vinyl cutting, because this is also a specialty that you have as well. And I think that, you know, there's not a lot of people do it. And like you said earlier, to learn this stuff, you kind of have to work at a mastering studio to be taught by someone who really knows it in order to actually learn it. So I'm curious to know, like, what does that process look like?
What about it? The finding the job, learning the vinyl cutting, or
let's talk about the actual, like, making a vinyl master. Like, what is involved in that? Is it kind of the same process as someone who's making a digital master?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah. So I'm gonna start my answer by saying that I actually wrote an article about mastering your music with the intent of doing a vinyl release. And I can send you the link and you can like add it to your show notes.
Absolutely.
But if you go to isotope.com and just search for vinyl mastering, there's going to be an article that talks about how to, like tips for digital mastering when you're releasing your music on vinyl. Because at the end of the day, the quick question is, your digital master will be enough to cut your music into a vinyl record. However, there's a lot of caveats on that statement, because the vinyl format is an old format. It's in fact like one of the oldest formats that's being sold commercially to this day. Like the height of the format itself was in the 70s, and there hasn't been really a lot of huge innovations on the format, and for good reason. Like vinyl is vinyl. And we appreciate the music in vinyl for the reasons that, because of its limitations, period. But I'm going to talk about like a few main limitations of the vinyl format to keep in mind if you know that you're releasing your music on vinyl. And this is covered in that Isotope article. But one of the things you have to keep in mind when you know you're releasing your music on vinyl is the sibilance. Because the nature of the physical format itself, the sibilance, like high energy, high frequency audio in your music, gets represented in the vinyl format as fast grooves, like really short, fast modulations of the groove on your vinyl record. And a sibilance has like really high energy, high frequency, and that the vinyl cutter can cut that record. However, your turntables and your stylus turntable won't be able to physically keep up with the waveform of the sibilance because of that energy. And what ends up happening is that your sibilance will sound like distortion on a vinyl record. And a lot of vinyl enthusiasts will be familiar with that sound. It's really just going to be distortion. And in fact, the vinyl article that I wrote for the website from Isotope, they're actually going to be releasing an update on the article, and I can show it to you, Mike, once it's available. But it includes an audio example of that distortion. So I applied a before and after that can lessen the effect of that distorted sibilance on a vinyl record. But essentially, if you don't have any, my advice when you're releasing your music on vinyl is see if you can communicate directly with the vinyl cutter, and they will know what is best to be done for the music. But if you don't really know where your music's going to be cut, it's good to just be mindful of the sibilance in your vocal, especially if like you it's a ballad album, or it's like a hard-hitting rock record where or even a pop record where that the vocal is going to be way up front and the sibilance is going to be like pop-esque, where it's like really intense, like sticking out. Control that sibilance, and you're already well on your way to having a great sounding vinyl record. So the next thing that is a common problem with vinyl records is low frequency phase effects. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that situation with vinyl formats, but if you have out of phase information in the low end, it's fine. But if it's too much, what ends up happening is the vinyl groove is going to end up being so thin to the point that it could even disappear for a moment and then just go back in. And that will potentially cause a needle skip on your vinyl record. So especially if your music is hip hop or electronic, if you know that your main audience is going to be listening to your music on the vinyl record, just keep in mind to not get carried away with all that like out of phase stereo panning effects in the low end, because low end like low frequency energy, the grooves tend to be bigger, and because if it's out of phase, how vinyl cutting works is that the stereo imaging, the stereo movements in your stereo mix is actually cut in lateral movement in a vinyl cutting process. Mm-hmm. The center image is cut in a vertical movement in the cutting stylus. And because in situations where there's so much out of phase information that the center image disappears, that's when the groove ends up thinning out and even like going away, and that causes needle skips. So vinyl cutters will have tools to avoid that. But the thing that ends up being done is usually applying a high pass filter just to like soften that build up in the low end. One thing that also happens in the vinyl cutting stage is the monoing of the low end. Like even Nugent has that tool. It's called mono filter. And we actually use that plugin in the studio. So that's a common tool. We don't always use it because we always prefer like not touching the low end.
Of course.
But if it's just too much, we will have to employ a tool that allows us to mono all the way down in the subharmonics. If you are going to be cost cutting and you're going to a place that really cuts vinyl for cheap, they will mono your low end way up to 200 hertz and above. That so just it's good to be mindful of that. Like if you're going to be cost cutting, the audio is going to be the first to be compromised on vinyl. So
it's not always necessary to mono your low frequencies then?
No, please don't.
Okay.
So I even wrote in the article that at the end of the day, don't mono your low end just because it's going on vinyl. Like I wouldn't want anyone to feel limited by their production, by their creativity and their music writing just because of those limitations on vinyl, because vinyl cutters have tools that allow them to control these details without compromising the music too much. But again, it all depends on the vinyl facility. Like some other facilities really just don't care. Mm-hmm. But we will have tools to address that. But if you have no idea where your vinyl's gonna go, where it's gonna get cut, just be mindful. You don't have to mono your low end. Just be careful of just look at your stereo imaging. There's a lot of tools by Isotope and even Nugent that allows you to look at the stereo imaging of your music. So yeah, just keep that in mind. But don't mono and over DS something just because you think it's gonna go on vinyl. I would much rather that you guys don't limit your creativity in the production process. But if you feel that there is no reason for you to go crazy with the phasing effects, just be mindful.
Yeah, of course. So then for someone who is going to be mastering for vinyl or sending their song off to be mastered for vinyl, and they're thinking like, oh, I should reduce some of the top end on this, or like mono the low end, or like how can someone tell when they've gone too far with that? Or is that really the job of like the person cutting the vinyl?
It's more of like asking yourself if there's a reason behind the overdone, like the over sibilance or the intense phase effects. But especially for like alt rock artists, like I'm not gonna tell them to mono their low end. It's don't let those limitations of the format limit your creativity. And to answer your question, the vinyl cutter will have tools. But especially if your music is like in electronic or alt rock, the vinyl format will have its limitations. Your music on a vinyl format will not be identical to the digital release. And that's really the reality of the format. So it's also a matter of like managing your expectations and also realize that the vinyl format will have surface noise. So, at the end of the day, the reasons why people love the vinyl format is not because of its like clean, high resolution, like digital clean audio, because that's the opposite of it. But the whole process of like listening to the music on vinyl is the routine of it all too. Like having the actual physical entity and owning the music with the vinyl format, and then pulling the record out of the jacket.
It's an experience.
Dropping side A, and the thing is with the vinyl format, you're listening to music in a loudspeaker, and that alone already is a huge difference versus someone listening with a Bluetooth speaker of an MP3. Like there's a reason why a lot of people associate vinyl with audiophile experience. It's really the whole routine, the ritual, and the loudspeaker experience. It's kind of like fine dining versus an MP3. Fine dining versus fast food. The ritual of it all and the physical ownership of the music is part of what makes vinyl amazing. But if you're releasing your music on vinyl for the first time, just manage your expectations that your music will sound differently between the vinyl and the digital release.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're trying to release your music on vinyl with the audiophile mindset, avoid using brokers. There's a lot of vinyl brokers out there that act as a middleman, where they do all the connections with the pressing plants, the cutters, because when you do that, the money goes not to the music but to the brokerage. And you have no idea on where your music is being produced or being cut. What I would recommend is that you go straight to a pressing plant and initiate your order with them. And I actually highly recommend this other podcast, and I can even connect you with them, Mike.
Sure.
They're called Women in Vinyl. That's why Nugent is offering that Women in Vinyl discount code. But I'm one of the board members of that nonprofit foundation. But Women in Vinyl they have this cool podcast where they go over every stage of the vinyl production process. And we're actually going to come out with an episode where we talk about how to release your music on vinyl as an indie artist and making a DIY preparation for releasing on vinyl. But yeah, don't feel intimidated by the whole process. A lot of artists feel that they can't release on vinyl because they don't know what happens or don't know where to start. It's not that difficult. And my main tip would be to avoid brokers, go straight to a pressing plant, and they will help you. And they will even, if you really want to go the audiophile approach, they can connect you directly with their vinyl cutter.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's funny, like years ago, I used to actually work for a CD vinyl manufacturing broker,
cool,
as well. So,
broker.
so I totally know that world really well.
Oops.
And no, it's totally cool. I actually agree 100% with what you're saying, because I remember back then that like people would get their records pressed, and we didn't even know what we were like, what our partners were doing, what people, the manufacturing plants were doing. So, time and time again, we would get people that would press stuff, and then the records would come back and they'd be like, oh, it sounds different, or like not the way I expected. It's like, I don't know what they did. Like, so I totally understand why going directly to the plant is the way to go. And I mean, why have a middleman to begin with? I understand the consumer side of it, right? And I totally agree with that. Like, I think at the end of the day, people don't realize that vinyl it's not this like digital thing that like just is replicated so perfectly every single time. There are so many variables in the process. And
Correct.
That's why it is such a art to have the skills to cut vinyl. Like, you really have to be very intimate with that machine to make it do what you want it to do. And I think a lot of people just think it's, I'm printing vinyl, whatever. Like, someone's just going to do it for me and it's always going to be perfect. But there are a lot of little steps involved. So definitely having someone who knows what they're doing is going to get you the results you want, right?
Exactly. And you know what? At the other end of the spectrum, there are also artists that understand that vinyl is more of a novelty and just a quick merch option where they can generate revenue. And there are also vinyl collectors who really don't open their vinyl records and are really just there to collect them. So I understand why some record releases don't really go for the audio quality and more for let's just churn these out and then let's deal with the vinyl broker, call it a day. They know how to do the packaging, great. So that's fine too. But again, if you're an indie artist and you really want to take care of your release, there's it's not difficult, and there are always people to help you out.
So at the end of the day, then, would you say that you could use a master that was made for a digital release for vinyl, or is it always going to get shaped to some degree by whoever's cutting it?
So that's the thing is, even if there's no shaping, like if it's, for example, a bluegrass easy record that's like a live performance where there's nothing complicated, and when we receive the digital master, it sounds great, we don't have to do anything. Even that whole process, there's some adjustment that happens because the process itself of cutting music on a record, it's also covered in the article that I wrote, but there's this EQ curve with the way music is cut on a vinyl record. Like any cutting lathe and any turntable will have the RIAA curve because the nature of the cutting stylus in the vinyl record, low frequency grooves are just really, it takes up so much space on a vinyl format as opposed to high frequency. So in order for music to fit better on a vinyl record, it gets cut with the RIAA curve, where it's kind of like a very steep curve that kind of lowers the energy of the low frequency, and there's more highs. But then all turntables will have the reverse RIAA curve, so it ends up becoming like a flat response playback. So it's kind of like the whole process of cutting any record on a vinyl format, there's going to be that adjustment that happens. So yeah, that's to answer your question. The whole process of vinyl cutting will influence the sound of the vinyl record, and even the whole process of, like, there are some vinyl facilities where they don't have time to QC and they just want a record that will pass and will not have any issues with distortion and needle skips. And they don't care about audio quality. What they'll just do is just lower the level of your music and call it a day. So there's no processing that happens. There's always going to be that RIA curve, okay? But by lowering the volume of your music, you avoid having any of these problems, except the signal floor just gets raised really intensely. And now you're dealing with the surface noise, the signal to noise ratio just becoming really bad. And at the end of the day, you also don't want that. So it's really a fine balance. The vinyl cutter has to have a lot of like techniques up their sleeve to just make music sing on a vinyl format. So yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. No, it's such an art. It's like it's so cool. And I think that there are a lot of factors in it that a lot of people just don't think about. It's like, especially because it's just like, especially now that people are making so much music from home, I feel like a lot of that kind of traditional path of like, mixing engineer to mastering engineer to vinyl plant or whatever, like, I think some of that has been lost to some degree now that people are just doing it on their own, and that traditional flow of who's working on your project is not there. So it's good to have resources like this or your article where people are learning about this stuff so that they can actually make informed decisions about how to go about making their records. One last question that I wanted to ask you about vinyl was just, are there... Let's talk about track order, because I know the track order can have an impact on vinyl.
I'm glad you asked, because that's one of the things that I was gonna add about like the quirks of the format. Sorry, feel free to finish your question.
No. Like I was gonna say, like, how important is it to have a specific track order?
It's very important, man, and I'm glad you reminded me, because I wasn't done like talking about the characteristics of the vinyl format. So there are two things you want to keep in mind when it comes to track orders if you're releasing on vinyl. Number one, if you're just mastering your own music and delivering it to a broker, or you're working with a company that will cut your vinyl, the best way to deliver your music is just one single audio for one side. And then just making sure that you list where the song starts for song 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like by sending like a one single audio file of side A and one single audio file of side B, there's less chance of like sequence changing happening at the vinyl cutting stage. But anyway, moving on to why track sequence is important. First of all, before we go to track sequence, let's talk about the song length, the side length of the music per side. It's important that you don't want your music length to go too long on your vinyl record, because the nature of the format, the farther you go in on your vinyl record, the fidelity in your highs on the top end starts to get brittle, and you get a lot of like high frequency loss the deeper you go into your vinyl record. So the further you are into the center of the record, you get some high fidelity loss. So you don't want to go way too far. So we always warn clients when they send us like a 25-minute side. We're already telling them this will be too long, and just know that there's going to be some compromise on the quality. One thing for us to be able to fit long sides on a vinyl record is to just bring down the overall volume. So we can fit more music, but then again, you're going to be dealing with a more tricky signal to noise ratio. You're going to have like a higher noise floor. So you don't want 25-minute sides. Regardless of the genre, we would recommend having 18 minutes of music per side, at the most 20 minutes. If it's gonna be like a very like sparse, organic, folk record, acoustic, you can go 22 minutes. But especially if it's like an EDM, hip hop, or rock record, aim for 18 minutes, because then we really get to cut your music on its full level, and we're not going too far into the inside of the disc for the highs to get brittle. In fact, on the Isotope article that I wrote, there are listening examples of how the music sounds when it's cut on the outermost side of the record versus inner. So going too long on your music will not be good for the music that's at the very end of your record. And this ties with the track sequence. So knowing that the reality of the vinyl format is high frequency fidelity loss at the innermost band of the record, keep that in mind when you're doing your track sequencing. So you wouldn't want your high energy music to be at the very last sequence on the side. So for example, side A, you have 5 songs. Keep your energetic, high energy, loud songs at the very start, or like song 1 to song 3. and then leave your more relaxed, chill music at the very last sequence. So that allows you to really get the most quality and experience out of each of the music. Because if you leave the high energy music down to the very last sequence on vinyl, it's just gonna sound brittle and distorted. And not because of sibilance, but it's really just there's high fidelity loss by the time you're at the very last song on the disc. So keep that in mind when you're doing your track order.
That's definitely good to know. And I think that totally explains why. Like, I remember just being in bands, and whenever we would make our records, it was like, how do we sequence things? And we would always look at all these records and be like, I think, like, you know, the loudest, like the biggest single is usually track 2 or 3 or something like that, you know, like, and it makes sense now, like when you think about the history of vinyl, that like, yeah, you're kind of taking people on this journey where it's like usually high energy at the beginning, kind of a bit of a lull in the middle, and then, you know, the end, you kind of, you know, it starts up again and then it dies down again, right? It's
like that's why the B-side has like some solid hits too, because you want your like next energetic records to be at the very start of side B. Because side B, you're down to like the outermost side again. So yeah,
it's such a again, it comes back down to like learning your foundations, right? And like this is the foundational knowledge that you need to know in order to like properly plan your album sequence. And when you know this stuff, and you are, I mean, maybe it doesn't matter as much these days when you're going completely digital, but you know, if you are planning on doing any sort of vinyl releases, then you 100% need to be aware of this stuff so that, you know, you're getting the best bang for your buck and your album sounds really good.
Exactly. So I highly recommend checking out the Women in Vinyl podcast, because they really do deep dives on every facet of the vinyl production process, like even the packaging, even the weight of the vinyl record. And then there are also different kinds of strategies to releasing your music. So you can release like the typical way where you work with vinyl cutters and then have a pressing plant. But then if you don't want to deal with like the long turnaround times right now, and you're only releasing like 50 copies or 100 copies, I also recommend checking out lathe cuts. So lathe cuts are different from the typical mass production of vinyl, because with lathe cuts, the lathe cutter cuts every record one at a time. So it's great for like small batch orders. There's actually one, and I think she's in Toronto or Vancouver, but one of the other board members of Women in Vinyl runs a lathe cut business. Yeah. And her name's Robin Raymond. She runs Red Spade Records in Canada.
Yeah, that's definitely in Toronto. It's funny, actually. I learned I also, when I was working at that manufacturing plant, we bought one of those lathes, and I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I think Robin is using the exact same lathe that I learned on. So yeah, like I learned some of this stuff too. That's why like some of these questions it's bringing me back. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the same machine that she had, but yeah, I mean those things it's definitely. That's why I'm so interested in what you do, because you're doing it on a much bigger, more professional level than on a lathe like that.
We use a Neumann SX74 cutter head. So yeah, like lathe cuts are in terms of quality, it's really not comparable to like the standard process that mass production is done on. But it really empowers a lot of the DIY community, like the indie, where they don't need to spend for a 500 quantity order just for them to make their vinyl dreams possible. They can do it with 10 discs with a lathe cut.
And even lathe cutting too, there's a big learning curve to that as well, right? I mean, it's a lot of these same principles that you're talking about that you do on that bigger level, they still apply with the lathe. Just with the lathe, you're typically dealing with like not as great quality of parts, you know, and that could be a challenge to some degree as well. So yeah, it definitely, like, everyone should check out lathes as well, just to get a sense of, you know, what the difference can be. But there are some out there, but I will say that like a lot of people I think are attracted to lathes because they think like, oh, I can just do it myself and it'll be cheap, because like they're not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. But I'll tell you that you're gonna be learning if you're trying to teach yourself this stuff, like, it's going to take you years to get it, it right.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's like, even if you don't have access to a vinyl record, like, just keep producing music, keep recording, mixing, mastering, and like, you might just end up in an opportunity where you can apprentice with the vinyl facility, like what happened to me. So yeah, just keep doing what you do, and just keep your eyes vigilant to opportunities that are in front of you.
Of course, yeah. Well, Jett, thank you so much for taking the time to do this podcast today. There was so much great information here, and I just think that this is definitely a topic that we haven't talked about on the podcast before. So it's something fresh that I think a lot of people will be really interested in learning. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to do this.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure, and you have so many awesome questions lined up today. I had a great time.
Awesome, thank you. So that was my interview with Jett Galindo, and that was really interesting. I really love the amount of detail that she went into about the vinyl cutting process and a lot of the little nuances that go into it, and ultimately why it's such a special craft that not many people know about. And it actually brought me back because many years ago, as I mentioned in the podcast, I worked for a manufacturing brokerage, and we did try to dip our toes into cutting vinyl ourselves, and we had bought a lathe, and the process of learning how to cut on a lathe is very difficult. It's unlike learning how to manipulate sound inside of your DAW. There's a lot of components that go into it, whether it's the machine itself or the material that the vinyl is made of or the diamond that you're using to cut things on. There's a lot of little nuances that you have to pay attention to every single detail and be very, very attentive to everything so that you make sure that you're cutting things properly. So it was really interesting to hear Jett talk about her process using some bigger machines like the Neumann that she uses versus using a lathe. And it also reaffirmed a lot of the feelings that I had when I was working at that manufacturing brokerage about whether people should be just going directly to the plant versus going through a third party. And I 100% agree with everything that Jett said in this interview. So it was definitely a lot of fun to go into that. And it definitely brought me back to a time many years ago. So I hope that you enjoyed that interview. I hope that you learned a ton out of it. I had a lot of fun with it, certainly. And if you want to hear more episodes like this, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live every Wednesday morning. We've got tons of great interviews lined up, and there's just so much more information that you can learn as a result of some of the upcoming interviews that we've got scheduled here. I've got a whole bunch that are just in the editing process as we speak, and yeah, there's so much gold coming out. So be ready for that, guys. Make sure to subscribe, and make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com. That is where I help out musicians with creating pro-sounding mixes from their home studios. And on the website, we've got tons of great resources designed to make the process of recording, editing, and mixing your music easy. One of which I definitely want to recommend you check out. It's called The Mixing Mindset, and it is a book where I break down the step-by-step process of mixing your tracks from home. And inside, I walk you through when to use things like EQ, compression, effects, automation, and so much more. If you are new to mixing, or if you've been working on your mixes for a while, but you're not quite happy with them, or if you're someone who's been working at this for a while, but your process is taking you a long time, and you're looking to speed it up, and you want to learn a workflow that lets you make better mixes in less time, definitely check out this book. Once again, it's called The Mixing Mindset, and it is available at MasterYourMix.com. So that is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really look forward to chatting with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@MasterYourMix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.